Welcome to. Hello, everyone, and welcome to World Arbitration Update, Washington, D.C. We've had a great last few days. We spent the first 2 days of WOW this year in Beijing. Fantastic event. Really appreciated the support of the Beijing Arbitration Commission and the Beijing International Arbitration Center. Fantastic group of supporters and sponsors and great speakers. We had 8 panels in Beijing. This morning, we had 2 additional panels in Doha, thanks to the organizers there. That went really well, and we very much appreciate their efforts as well. Great speakers, great topics. So we're here in Washington, and we have a panel here today, which is continuing on with the great quality of WOW this year. We are graced with a good group to address the topic titled Impact on Investment Arbitration of the US and Other Countries' Elections in 2024. So getting down into the weeds on some political and legal developments and what that what will happen, hopefully or not, maybe in the next year. So it's my pleasure to introduce Marilyn Carlson, who's an independent arbitrator here in Washington, D.C. Marilyn is the former co-chair of the arbitration group at Sidley Austin. She's now arbitrating and doing very well. She is an adjunct professor at GW here in Washington, D.C., and has been one of the leaders of the arbitration community in Washington, and really appreciate, Marilyn, you're taking this task on today of moderating such a unruly group. So let me pass the microphone to you, and let's get started.
Thank you so much, Ian. And first of all, on behalf of our entire panel, our thanks to World Arbitration Update for bringing us together, for Ian and Jose Antonio for thinking of and bringing the entire idea of the World Arbitration Update Conference to fruition, and really making this topic globally accessible. And I think this conference does that in a way that few others can and do. So this panel was inspired by the fact that in 2024, we are expecting to see elections in at least 64 countries. And that represents almost 60% of the world's population is going to have an election this year of some level of significance. Those elections, I have on the screen a list of the elections in question, although apparently I'm also getting all my feed as well. But the elections, some of them, of course, are general elections. Some of them are only legislative elections. Some of them are presidential elections, depends on the system. But those elections are happening and are likely, no matter what we do, they're going to have massive political impact, but we think they will also have impact on the world of international arbitration, and especially on the world of investment treaty arbitration. So far this year, we are up to the ones in yellow. You'll note India is ongoing, so I haven't given them a yellow mark yet. And the Dominican Republic was yesterday. So this is a very hot topic, a constantly moving target. Iran, as we've learned over the weekend, is going to have another election. But we've gone through a number of them, and we have more to come. We obviously, this is a very long list, and so we're not going to try to cover every single country on it today. But we have a great panel assembled that's going to get us through at least with the ones in red. So we will ourselves be covering a large swath of the world's population. And for that task, as I said, we've assembled a great panel. And so let me just do very brief introductions, although many of them are going to be known to you already, and others you will be able to find out more about if you consult their LinkedIn profiles and the like. So I won't go into great depth about their accomplishments. But first, to my immediate right, we've got Pushkar Keshler-Murthy, who's an Indian qualified advocate in Washington, D.C., an LLM graduate from Georgetown University specializing in international arbitration, and previously worked as a case manager at the Mumbai Center for International Arbitration and as counsel in commercial litigation and arbitration disputes in India. Pushkar is going to lead us off with an overview of the elections in some of the world's most populous democracies in South Asia. Then to his right is Mark Konstantinidis, who's a doctoral candidate and visiting lecturer at King's College in London with a full scholarship from KCL Center of European Law. I got to know some of his work because he serves as the senior editor of the AFILA, the European Federation for Investment Law and Arbitration blog. And he's a qualified lawyer in Greece and the EU and registered at the Athens Bar. We've given Mark the small task of covering all of Europe, including in particular the European Parliament elections. And then to Mark's right is Gaela Gehring Flores, who's a partner and global co-chair of international arbitration at Hughes, Hubbard & Reed here in Washington, D.C. And she has over 25 years of experience representing both multinational corporations and sovereign states in international commercial and investment arbitration. And she is also co-host of the excellent The T podcast, The T in International Arbitration podcast, brought to you by the DC Bar International Law Community, which I highly recommend. Gael is going to be tackling some key countries in Central America, in addition, chiming back in when we get to the United States for some additional color there. To her right, we've got Eduardo Matheson, who's counsel in Kroll and Mooring's International Dispute Resolution Group with a particular focus in Latin America, although based here in Washington, D.C. He concentrates his practice on international arbitration and litigation matters for clients in both investment and commercial disputes, and also has experience representing foreign and domestic clients, including victims of terrorism in sovereign immunity litigation. Eduardo is going to be making us smart on elections in Venezuela and Mexico, among other countries in Latin America. And then we come to Lauren Mandel, at the far end of the table, who's a partner at WilmerHale in Washington, specializing in dispute resolution under trade agreements and investment treaties. He had a recent tenure at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where he served as the U.S. lead negotiator for the investment chapter of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, the replacement to NAFTA, and played a major role in other key trade negotiations under the Obama and Trump administrations. Lauren's seen multiple very different U.S. administrations from the inside, so we've given him the challenge of the U.S. election, no small task, plus sharing some thoughts on Mexico and Canada, assuming we have time for all of that. So as you see, we have a lot to cover, but we are well armed with a great panel to do so. And so I suggest we just go ahead and launch in. So Pushkar, will you start us off?
Sure. Thanks very much, Marilyn, for your kind introduction. And of course, thanks to the World Arbitration Update for making this happen. And I think the topic is quite timely. And since there's less of time, but more to cover, I'll jump straight into some of the South Asian democracies which have gone to elections, and one of them is currently in election. So I'll start with India, which is my home country. So elections is going on under 7 phases, and 5th phase is on. The results is going to come out on 4th of June. But irrespective of what really happens in this address, perhaps I would focus on some of the key changes that could potentially impact for investments and investors, and of course, the ongoing disputes and treaty negotiations that India is having with other counterparts. So assuming that we're going to have the present administration to continue for a 3rd time, then we're not going to expect a radical shift in regulatory framework. But that being said, there is a possible ministerial and bureaucratic top leadership change or reshuffle, as it has happened in the past, and that could potentially impact on few key changes that could come forth. And I'm particularly looking at some of the sectors such as space, mining, semiconductor manufacturing, and also to some extent port and airport infrastructure constructions. So these are a few things that could impact irrespective of who comes to power, because that has been seen as one of the driving force of major capital inflow and development in the region. But just to give a quick overview in the space sector, which I think would be of much interest for the US audience, because everyone seems to be focusing on NASA. But of course, we have our own NASA type in India called ISRO, Now that we have 100% FDI, possibility for investments, there could be a significant amount of investments coming in the manufacture of satellites, spectrum allocation, and also to some extent even satellite systems in itself. That being said, moving quickly to others, which I don't want to take much of time, but on the BIT landscape, now, as most of you all know, India has terminated almost 70 plus bilateral investment treaties since 2016. We have had a new model BIT as a major shift from the previous model. Now, that being said, India is also trying to renegotiate with its former partners, and some of them on top of my mind and in my notes, I have about 6 or 7. But the one that is quite recent and quite relevant for today's discussion is, in the wake of elections being announced, India signed a treaty with UAE, which is one of the very strong trading partners of India. Now, this happened on 13th February, and the draft is not out yet, but seems like this has been an extraordinary effort on a very short span of time. On 10th of March, India signed another treaty, though it does not have an ISDS clause. We'll come to that later, with the European Free Trade Association, comprising of Switzerland, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. Now, even this treaty is something that we are very much closely watching on how best cross-border trade investment could promote. But the unfortunate, or rather fortunate, which depends on what side of the coin you are, is it does not have an ISDS clause. Now, this is something expected from Indian trading partner, but on the side of India and EU free trade agreement talks, there has been a consistent push for having multilateral investment court, which India has been not considerably favoring for. At the same time, European Union wants to have the exhaustion of local remedies, the duration of 5 years to be reduced. And that is something that the Indian model BIT has been having for a while now, but that has been something they want to perhaps cut down on. But I won't go through all the negotiations, but the key ones that are ongoing are India, UK, which is on the 14th round. And same problems, as I said, about EU still exists regarding exhaustion of local remedies. India, Oman, India, Russia, Australia, Sri Lanka, Chile, Argentina. Now, all these potential PITs would be signed after the elections are announced or perhaps the results are out. So we're having a close watch on what's really happening with those FTAs and BITs. But that being said, I'll take a minute to flag a couple of investment arbitration awards, which, as very well most of you know, India's had some unfortunate awards with Ken, Vodafone, and retrospective taxation. But it has some good awards as well in the recent past with GPIX on airport baggage handling case and the Rakia mining case. The Deutsche Telekom and Devas, which is on the spectrum allocation, has been on the unfavorable side for India, which the enforcement has been going on across the globe, including in the US, more so in the DC District Court. But the ones to watch in the next couple of months and years would be the award in the second Devas case, which is ongoing at the moment as we speak, and also the Covepo case of a South Korean entity. But the bigger thing, which is making a buzz in India and that part of the region, is an upcoming case against India on the gold mining dispute, which, as we all know, mining disputes are on the rise. And this gold mining dispute has been threatened by notice of dispute by Indo Gold, an Australian company with parent company of Panther Resources based in the UK. So I'll stop it there, but I'll quickly switch gears. And I know my time is short, and I want to let all my other distinguished panelists have their say on the rest of the democracies. But quickly going through, Pakistan had its election in February amidst political turmoil. It's safe to say that there's still economic instability. There's a very big debt looming crisis, which, as we can expect, almost to the tune of $24 billion, which is due by the end of June 2024, so literally next month. So we don't know what's going to happen, but at the same time, it has terminated some of its treaties and renegotiations are ongoing. Quickly going to Bangladesh, elections happened in early Jan. Sheikh Hasina won her 4th consecutive record term. Now, that's an interesting space to watch because it's one of the most populous countries with a very small geographical area. So there's excellent growth opportunity for human capital and the way in which human resources could be utilized for manufacturing and many others to compete with China and other major hubs. But that being said, one good thing to notice, or rather bad thing to notice, is most of the Bangladesh BITs have a denial of benefit clause under FET, which you really need not have to prove expropriation to bring this claim. So this is something that it has been raised in Saipan versus Bangladesh, and we can expect some more of those in the next ones to come. Quickly going to Indonesia and Sri Lanka, I know I'm not going to rush, but at the same time, want to cover some of the significant features here. Now, Sri Lanka is also in an economic debt crisis. As some of you know, China has been helping out, or rather has made them, based on what perceptions people may have. But that being said, Sri Lankan elections is expected later this fall, and we are expecting to see what best that may turn out. And India and Sri Lanka is also having a free trade BIT talks, so it'll be interesting to note that space as well. On the Indonesia side, the former leader was banned from contesting elections for at least 10 years. So that being said, the former defense minister has now won the election in Indonesia, and that has led to, and now that person, even though he's relatively older, when I say relatively, I mean 70s, he is a big fan of TikTok and technological savvy person. So he's very fond of youth and what could happen with the young generation, which is contributing to the economy. So he seems like someone who wants to improve bilateral trade talks with the neighboring countries. So that's another space to watch, with Indonesia projected as next South Asia hub. And one of the major reasons being he's trying to move the capital city from Jakarta to another city. So that could potentially impact a lot of investments inflows as well. But I'll stop it here and I'll save it for next round. Thanks, Maureen.
Thanks much. I did actually catch a reference on it when I was looking at Indonesia's election to the fact that, yes, he had made an animated avatar of himself on TikTok in order to appeal to younger voters. Maybe that's next for the US election. Lauren, let us know. All right, Mark, so you want to take us then to Europe?
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be part of World Arbitration Update, in particular this panel. As Marin said, I will speak about the impact of elections in Europe on investment arbitration, and due to time constraints, I can't help but be highly selective. So I hope you can appreciate that. But if there are any questions, of course, I'm happy to return to any particular points. Allow me to begin by saying a few words on elections which have already taken place across Europe over the last few months. In terms of kind of political commentary that is out there, it's clear that there's been overall kind of a shift towards center-right and right-wing parties, but one should be cautious about kind of inferring a unified political trend. Some elections, even where they did lead to a change in government, are not expected to lead to any kind of drastic policy shifts or reduction in terms of international engagement. In January, we saw a new president being elected in Finland, who is a very strong supporter of Finland's kind of course within the EU and now NATO. So he's expected to support Finland's international agenda within the new kind of geopolitical context after the escalation in the war in Ukraine. Similarly, in terms of impact, in March, we saw parliamentary elections in Portugal leading to a new center-right government succeeding a long-term center-left administration. There are questions there in terms of governability, and we're not quite sure how the parliamentary dynamics will evolve because it's a minority government, but still in terms of the overall course, policy course of the country, in terms of investment matters, it doesn't seem likely that there will be drastic policy shifts, famous last words, but as far as we know. And in Croatia as well, we saw the re-election of the incumbent government, which is generally seen as pro-EU and pro-business. Other elections that have happened recently are likely to generate greater uncertainty. In the last couple of months, North Macedonia went through presidential and parliamentary elections, in both of which the main opposition Nationalist Party prevailed. North Macedonia is a candidate for accession to the European Union. The new president and incoming government are seen to, in effect, be opposing normalization with neighboring countries, Greece and Bulgaria. And this, compounded by the perception that the government, the party is pro-Russia, I think has the capacity of undermining efforts of the country to join the European Union. So, and the economic and institutional reforms that this entails. This may create the potential for generating disputes. Presidential elections in Slovakia in the last few months also led to the election of a president who is seen to be friendly to Russia, potentially exacerbating uncertainty in terms of foreign policy, including sanctions, as well as environmental policy. So it's interesting to see how this evolves on a national level, but also how this will affect EU level policy as well. Now, perhaps more importantly, in terms of policy impacts, between the 6th and 9th of June, there will be European Union elections in which citizens of EU member states will be voting for the composition of the European Parliament. The European Parliament is one of the two legislating institutions of the European Union, the other being the Council of Ministers of Governments of member states. But the elections are not just about the composition of the Parliament itself. That is, of course, very important, but at the same time, a majority of Parliament needs to confirm the appointment of the new President of the European Commission, the head of the executive body of the European Union, following a nomination of a name by the member states. So this is, I think, even more likely to have a policy impact. The European People's Party is expected to come first. This is the center-right grouping, but the question is whether it will be able to form its traditional coalition with the center-left and liberal groupings, or if there will be a need to reach out to more right-wing parties. So in this light, I envisage three issues in terms of impact on investment law and investment arbitration. Firstly, even if the president of the commission, the incumbent one, I mean, Ursula von der Leyen, is reappointed, the parliamentary dynamics will profoundly shape the EU's regulatory and legislative agenda over the next 5 years. This will shape the policy landscape in Europe and may generate, or conversely, perhaps preempt disputes. We have seen in environmental policy, the European Green Deal being somewhat rolled back vis-a-vis its application on agriculture. And we must also wait and see if there will be any changes concerning environmental or energy subsidies, which is sometimes floated. Of course, the overall kind of policy direction in terms of decarbonization is not questioned, but its delivery might be recalibrated. The agenda of strategic autonomy, which is an EU term, will continue, including developing instruments responding to the geopoliticization of foreign investment. So we will see an overhaul of screening mechanisms of foreign direct investment, inbound investment, as well as perhaps the introduction of outbound FDI screening. Secondly, the European Parliament risks becoming increasingly skeptical of free trade agreements or investment treaties which provide for investment arbitration. This is a trend which we see in many countries across Europe and perhaps beyond. This will complicate the ratification of investment protection agreements as well as their negotiation. For example, with Indonesia, Mexico, and even Pushkar mentioned this, it's in early stages, but the agreement with India that is negotiated. Thirdly, the composition of the European Parliament and Commission can affect the EU's commitment to reforming ISDS before the Ancestral Working Group 3, and even bilaterally in negotiations with third states. The EU and its member states have been spearheading efforts to reform investment arbitration as a way to balance the needs of, on the one hand, investment protection, on the other hand, concerns in terms of regulatory autonomy, as well as the credentials, the rule of law credentials of ISDS, and the workability of the governing coalition at the EU institutions will determine whether the Commission has the bandwidth to continue pushing for these types of reforms. For instance, the Multilateral Investment Court. I expect that there will be bandwidth, but the Commission will need to work harder to ensure that it does not get distracted by kind of aggravated political posturing. And this is the euphemism of my presentation. In terms of the UK, the United Kingdom is expected to hold elections. Well, it's January 2025, but really it's by the end of 2024. The main opposition Labour Party is 20 points ahead in the polls. So that is where we're at. At the moment, the Labour Party is keen to assert its business-friendly credentials and has adopted a largely centrist agenda. This includes a net zero policy, which again has been recently rolled back, but there is a commitment to decarbonize energy production, inter alia by expanding wind capacity that is expected to unfold on a big scale. There's also a plan to renationalize all railway operators, but in a gradual way, again, in light of the political context that I explained. And what is expected is to continue the discussion on the UK's regulatory approach, which has been ongoing since really the Brexit referendum. Will the UK choose to align or partially align with EU standards? Is it willing to compromise on its environmental or public health standards for the sake of greater foreign investment, or perhaps increased chances of securing trade and investment agreements? That is something we will have to wait and see. Secondly, following Brexit, the UK has embarked on extensive negotiations for trade and investment agreements with several states, but it has yet to develop a comprehensive strategy post-Brexit concerning what it frankly thinks of ISDS. In its negotiations with Canada, which have stalled for other reasons, the UK has said that it does not consider ISDS to be appropriate. It has also mirrored the EU's approach in terms of withdrawing from the Energy Charter Treaty, but at the same time, the UK has accepted an unreformed kind of orthodox version of ISDS within the context of the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. So we need to kind of wait for an elucidation of the UK's approach post-Brexit. One should not hold one's breath, but this will, I think, crystallize in due course. Now, allow me to say very few words about the coming elections beyond the EU and the UK ones, which should be on one's radar. I will only focus on a couple, but I'm happy to go into more detail on more elections. There are presidential elections in Lithuania, which are due to complete in a few days. The reason why I'm selecting this as one to watch is because the current prime minister is running to become president against the incumbent president, and the current prime minister is famously pro-Taiwan, and this has seriously affected the relationships between Lithuania and China, which has underpinned the development of an anti-coercion instrument at the European Union level. So that may have geopolitical implications in that regard. Also, the Austrian legislative elections will take place by autumn. Currently, the polls suggest that the FPO party, which is the far-right party, will win. It is not clear whether or with whom it will be able to enter into a government, but this will be an election to watch. If that party were to lead government, this would likely have a significant effect in terms of environmental policy, as well as foreign policy, including sanctions and trade policy as well. And this could also undermine Austria's relationship with Brussels. And finally, Moldova has its presidential elections in October. Moldova is a candidate for EU accession as well. The incumbent president, who is seen as being pro-EU and is seen as a reformist, is ahead in the polls, but it's too early to tell, and the country is restructuring its energy supply structures in terms of electricity and gas, seeking to completely wean off of Russian or Russian-controlled energy sources. So for these kind of geopolitical reasons, the course of the elections may affect its energy policy. So overall, Europe is undergoing a period of significant political change, which should not be overstated. At the EU level, there are uncertainties and there will be challenges that will emerge, but we see a recalibration, as I said, rather than a dramatic policy change. EU energy policy may be partially rebalanced. I think this appears to be the main evolution post the elections. More importantly, there seems to be significant skepticism in national legislatures vis-a-vis ISDS, and this may impede national but also EU investment policy ambitions. And the answer to that, as far as the EU is concerned, is to reform ISDS, but of course that also takes political capital and will. The UK has yet to settle on a strategy on investment treaties and ISDS in a post-Brexit context, and the British regulatory landscape will crystallize after the coming general elections and will be affected perhaps more than is acknowledged publicly by its future rapprochement with the European Union. And in terms of elections that are important to watch, beyond the EU and the UK ones, I would single out Austria and Moldova because for different reasons, geopolitical kind of factors may significantly affect energy policy in particular. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mark. And I forgot when I was introducing Gaela that she's also going to be the one person who gets to go back to 2023. She's also going to talk about Argentina as well. So shift us across the Atlantic and take us into Latin America.
Thank you, Marin, and thanks to the World Arbitration Update and everyone who's here today. It's great to see everybody and all those online. Yes, I was the one who wanted to look under the hood a little bit to 2023 because I wanted to remind everyone that Argentina had an election at the very end of 2023 that brought us some interesting developments. And I also wanted to kind of glom on to the idea of change. A lot of the rhetoric that one sees in the press regarding elections and the different parties involved in elections is that parties that are associated more with the right tend to be more pro-investment or pro-business. And you kind of tend to see a generalization that, oh, well, that must be good for investment. That must be good, for a general investment climate and for not fomenting more disputes. But I think it is more apt to focus on change and uncertainty and the amount of change and uncertainty that's happening. And I do think that we see a lot in the world, a lot of change and uncertainty involving administrations going to extremes, whether it's the extreme right or the extreme left. And for those of us who've been doing investment arbitration for quite some time, that is the best formula for an investment arbitration, honestly, when you have some huge shift, some huge regulatory or policy shift from the left to the right or the right to the left. So just a reminder, look out for change. It's not necessarily true that if an incoming administration is more to the right, that this is suddenly going to be a better environment for stability, because you might be looking at a huge pendulum shift. And whenever you're looking at pendulum shifts, you're usually looking at an environment that is quite ripe for an investment dispute. And also a reminder that the populism that seems to be pretty inescapable in today's politics can come from the left and come from the right. And it also tends to have a fair share of nationalism and isolationism built in, which is pretty much the antithesis of the Bretton Woods system that a lot of our investment arbitration was built upon. So again, when you see big shifts either to the right or to the left, you're looking at a recipe for investment arbitration disputes. And I did plan on talking about the DR first, because the Dominican Republic just had its election yesterday. But of course, the headlines that popped up on my phone first today was about Argentina and about, so again, going back a bit to 2023. At the end of 2023, President Milei was elected in Argentina. He is of the far right, and he made it known even to more of the world, even more publicly, that he is of the far right by participating in a very far right conference that happened in Madrid, supporting candidates like France's Marine Le Pen and the prime ministers from Italy and Hungary. And the result of his participation in that conference was Spain cutting ties with Argentina. So, you know, just a little bit of change out there. And that is just something to watch. It's something to watch when you have, regardless of the political identity of a candidate, when you have a candidate that's going out into the geopolitical world and acting so perhaps unpredictably, perhaps bombastically. Milei has now succeeded in straining or cutting ties with a number of countries, including Colombia, Chile, and Mexico. So whenever you have a political leader engaging in such volatile conduct, you might see a concomitant rise in investment disputes, particularly in a nation like Argentina, where everyone is looking to invest in lithium. So we've got mining on the line in Argentina, and people are looking at Argentina compared to Chile and Bolivia in particular, as a country that has relatively or comparatively fewer regulatory requirements. Lithium companies can be completely privately owned in Argentina, and that's not necessarily the case in Chile or Bolivia or in Mexico. So you do have a lot of foreign investment really keenly interested in Argentina. That is currently being led by a far right leader that is known for being a bit volatile. And just as, you know, keeping score a bit, Argentina up to today has had a total of 65 investment arbitrations brought against it. 8 of those are pending. Moving on to the Dominican Republic, which in comparison to Argentina might be a bit boring, but boring is what investment likes. Boring likes certainty. Boring does not like a lot of change, or investment doesn't like a lot of change. So boring is good. Yesterday, the president Abinader was reelected in the Dominican Republic, and he comes from a pretty centrist, if not centrist, maybe a little bit right position. He's known for adeptly handling the COVID crisis, his anti-corruption platform, and also his harsh politics against Haiti. So you might, you know, particularly with respect to a variety of ESG due diligence, supply chain due diligence laws that are coming out of Europe, maybe out of California, you might see those countries that are maybe not as advanced on environmental, human rights, and governance lines. You might see investment disputes popping up because the suppliers in those countries that are part of the supply chain are not able to comply with perhaps more robust standards. So look out for that in countries that, you know, maybe there's not a big change, but if there's a human rights element, if there's an environmental element, maybe like in Argentina, you might see some investment disputes popping up. Panama, also very interesting, just a few weeks ago, elected President Mulino who was the running mate of former President Martinelli. Now, Martinelli the Panamanian Supreme Court decided that Martinelli could not run for president. They did decide that Mulino could run. That was a decision that everyone was watching in Panama. And everyone is waiting to see essentially if Mulino will be truly separate from Martinelli. That's the big question. That's the big uncertainty. If Mulino can rule without essentially being a puppet of Martinelli, then you will likely see a Panama that is relatively unchanged, that is more pro-business, that it has been in the past. But everyone's just kind of waiting to see what happens. Mulino has, up to this point, said the right things, and he has nominated a cabinet which is very pro-business and very pro-investment. So relatively boring. Boring is good, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. We'll also see what happens with respect to the copper mining dispute that has been following and has been quite a large and significant dispute in Panama for the past couple of years. We'll see how the Mulino administration deals with all of the disputes that that the copper mine has generated. And lastly, El Salvador. In February, Bukele was reelected, which I guess you might say is boring because he is remaining on, but Bukele in himself is not boring at all. I would classify the Bukele gambit as law and order plus cryptocurrency. And maybe some investors were very attracted by his clampdown on law and order. They were not so attracted by his dive into cryptocurrency and investing a large portion of El Salvador's reserves into cryptocurrency. It might work out in the end, but again, this is an administration that is seen as quite volatile and certainly not high on the list of human rights organizations these days. So when you see political leaders that are volatile and almost universally reviled by human rights advocates, you might see some investment disputes popping up there as well. I think that is the end of my review.
Great. So Eduardo, you want to keep going through our tour of Latin America?
Yeah, we'll do. But I want to say that, you described it perfectly. We're looking for drastic changes here. In Latin America, especially, there's always a tendency from the press to label a particular candidate or a party by being right-wing or left-wing, but that's not what, that's probably was the focus maybe like 20 years ago, but not today. I will talk about 3 countries, Venezuela, Mexico, and Uruguay. I will start with my home country, Venezuela. They will hold presidential elections in late July, or at least that's what's been on the schedule, but nothing is set in stone in Venezuela, so anything could really change. The 2 candidates we have is, of course, Nicolás Maduro, the incumbent president. He's running for a 3rd term, I think, combined with late President Chavez. That would be their 6th or 7th term. It's been like 25 years now. Extremely low popularity, but absolute control over all institutions and communication, like traditional communication platforms. No one is expecting a different outcome other than Nicolás Maduro winning in a heavily manipulated election. The opposition runner is his name is Edmundo González. He's a former ambassador and diplomat with no prior experience in politics, or not, at least not running for office. He's just basically the name on the ballot that Nicolás Maduro allowed the opposition to
register. The real candidate behind Gonzalez is Maria Corina Machado, who's been, she's been in the opposition for like probably from day one when Chavez took office in 1999. She massively won the opposition primaries last fall with a lot of support locally and also internationally. Of course, because of all of this, she was barred from running. She tried a replacement by endorsing a senior professor called Corina Lloris, given the similarities with the names. But she faced registration issues. Suddenly the portal where you were supposed to register your name to run for elections wasn't working the last 3 days before the deadline, so they didn't let her file. So ultimately, she decided to endorse Edmundo Gonzalez, which is basically the remaining like non-government related name that was on the ballot. So basically, he's gonna be running on her behalf. But I mean, in terms of expected results, I mean, Maduro's plan, it's always been to handpick his opposition. That's what they've been doing successfully for like 20 years. So I mean, nothing. I mean, they're not going to allow anything that will represent any minimal threat to Maduro's power. I'm actually surprised that Gonzalez is still on the ballot. He might be barred from running at some point between now and the end of July. Regardless, we expect that Maduro is going to win the election, or at least that he's going to announce that he won the election, with no institution really contesting that result. But Maduro is very unpopular, and Maria Corina Machado is gaining a lot of support. So there's always a possibility for change, but I've been saying that for 10 years and nothing has happened, so I'm probably wrong. I would say that if Maduro stays in power, we should expect, continuing political, social, and economic instability, a very challenging environment for the private sector, more expropriations, arbitrary measures, in general, no protections for either domestic or international or foreign investors. That's what's been going on in the last, especially in the past 5-6 years. A lot of political instability, hyperinflation, and all of this combined, this has led to one of probably the most severe humanitarian crisis that has been recorded in recent times in Latin America. Over 6 million refugees right now, Venezuelans that have been forced to flee Venezuela in the last 5 or 6 years. So we're expecting just another victory from Maduro, likely fraudulent. It's just a matter of what's going to be crucial here is how the international community is going to approach this. If they're going to give a similar approach to what they did in 2018, particularly the EU and the United States government. As you know, the US government imposed sanctions on the government of Venezuela. They designated the government of Venezuela as an SDN, also PDVSA, and also many individuals that are close to the Maduro regime. But it's quite unclear, and I don't want to go into the next portion of our presentation about elections in the United States, but it's still unclear at least how the current administration is going to approach these elections and these results. They have a different, I would say they have a different style or approach to managing the situation in Venezuela compared to the previous administration. So it's still yet to be seen. Of course, if the opposition wins, I mean, the sky is the limit. I would expect, though, in the short term, there's I would expect like at least a small list of arbitration claims coming in. There's a long list of potential claimants that are basically waiting because of enforcement limitations. But after that, I think in general, I mean, it will be, this is the desire. I mean, a change in Venezuela is a desired outcome, not only for the country, but for the entire region. I will mention something very quickly before I'm done with Venezuela, because you probably heard the name of Juan Guaido a lot in previous years. For those who are wondering where he is, he For those who don't know, he ran Venezuela's interim government that was recognized by more than 50 countries in the world. That was around maybe between 2019 and 2023 or so. Of course, I mean, after being unable to remove Maduro from power, he still controls the military and the state. The interim government was partially dismantled, and Juan Guaidó is no longer in the role. He was forced to flee Venezuela to avoid persecution by the Maduro regime, and he's now supporting publicly Maria Corina Machado from the exile. That's what we have on Venezuela. Turning to Mexico, which is more immediate, we have what is going to be the largest election ever in Mexico. We have on June 2nd, we're going to have presidential elections. We're going to have a new Congress, several governors, also local representatives, pretty massive election. The two candidates, Claudia Sheinbaum, she's the former mayor of Mexico City, and she's an ally of current president Andrés López Obrador, or as people know him, AMLO. She's the one who's leading the polls, at least that what it seems to be. On the opposition side, you have Xochitl Galvez. She represents an also kind of historic opposition and alliance that involves several traditional parties in Mexico, like PRI and PAN and others. Here, of course, I wanna, with the caveat that I'm not Mexican, I'm not an expert in politics in Mexico. I very well acknowledge the complexity and how diverse the politics in general are in Mexico, but we could expect, I mean, in general, I would say if Sheinbaum wins, which is what seems to be expected, I would expect at least to continue the policies of President AMLO, and that means either keeping or increasing regulations, especially in key sectors like energy, also keeping or increasing public spending, and I think in general, I would say a challenging environment for investors. If Galvez wins, there might be some economic reforms to reduce state intervention and to increase private sector's involvement, which is going to be seen as pro-business, pro-investors. But there could also be some austerity measures post-COVID, or at least in response to the last few years under AMLO. So just like describe it, I mean, there could be, there are always winners and losers, and when you go to the extremes, there's always an opportunity for investment disputes. Before I move on, I want to highlight the historical significance of this election in Mexico, which is set to elect Mexico's first female president. And this is, I think, a huge milestone that I think is very significant, not only given Mexico's, but also in general, Latin America's history of machismo and in general, the context of gender inequality in the region. I'm hoping that this election will symbolize a major shift in the cultural and social dynamics in the entire region, regardless of who is elected. We'll see. Very quickly on Uruguay, they will be holding presidential elections in late October. My understanding is that there still will be some primaries, so we don't know who the final runners will be, but we're expecting the two main parties to be the favorites for this election, the Partido Nacional, which is the current ruling party led by President Luis Lacalle. If they need to be labeled somehow, I think it will be seen more towards the right-wing side, and on Frente Amplio on the opposition, that is more leaning towards the left wing. But I wouldn't expect any radical changes beyond what is normal in any transition between the administrations. I think for Uruguay, the key here is stability. Uruguay has a strong, unlike the rest of the region, has a strong democratic tradition, steady economic growth, high levels of transparency, low corruption levels compared to the region. So I would I would say that Uruguay is by far one of the most stable countries in the region, and that's music to investors. So that's what investors want to hear, and I shouldn't expect any major changes after these elections. But we'll see. It's Latin America, so you don't know.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. So, Lauren, not much to talk about, right?
Thank you, Marin, and thank you to the organizers and my co-panelists and the guests here today. I'm embarrassed by the wealth of knowledge and wisdom at the panel here today, in that I'll just focus on one election, the US presidential election on November 5th. Like many Americans, I may be only qualified to talk about developments here at home, but I've learned a lot today thus far. And ISDS, I think, is a small issue, obviously, in the sort of hugely important elections in November, but it is an important election for ISDS for many reasons. And I will, in my discussion, I'll focus exclusively on policy towards ISDS. For example, the negotiation of agreements with ISDS. I will not talk about regulatory developments and others that we might anticipate under a Biden or a Trump administration. And so, setting the scene, where is ISDS now in the United States? In short, ISDS is under threat. It became a lightning rod political issue in the United States during the TPP negotiations, the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations 10 years ago. But at the time, ISDS still had pretty significant bipartisan support in the United States. For example, President Obama, supported ISDS in TPP. He and his administration thought that the TPP agreement improved ISDS rules and procedures, and also the substantive investment protection standards in the agreement in a way that balanced, protection of investment and government's important right to regulate. And also at the time, there were efforts during TPP to strip ISDS out of the agreement. For example, Senator Elizabeth Warren proposed an amendment to the Trade Promotion Authority, which is the sort of legislative vehicle that enabled, or that would have enabled, TPP to be considered by Congress had the president submitted it to Congress. Elizabeth Warren proposed to strip ISDS out. It failed in the Senate, 60-39. Now, fast forward to the Trump administration. When President Trump was elected in 2016, he appointed Robert Lighthizer as the US Trade Representative. And Ambassador Lighthizer was very skeptical of the value of ISDS to the United States. He was skeptical for both defensive and offensive reasons. Defensively, he objected in principle to the United States, US laws and regulations, court decisions being subject to review by an arbitration tribunal. Offensively, he argued that enabling or providing US investors with access to ISDS would incentivize US companies to move jobs and production abroad. And so again, for offensive and defensive reasons, he was opposed. He was determined to significantly narrow access to ISDS in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA. He ultimately succeeded. In the USMCA, ISDS between the US and Canada is gone. Also between Mexico and Canada is gone. And between the US and Mexico, access to ISDS is significantly narrowed. US business community and the private sector fought for ISDS in that negotiation, but largely in the shadows. And now fast forwarding to today, the Biden administration, during the campaign in the 2019-2020 period, the Biden team indicated that the President Biden would not support ISDS. And in the last 3 years, there's really been no way to test that position, because the United States has not engaged in traditional trade or investment negotiations. And so it's never been a sort of a policy issue on the table to include ISDS in agreements or not. There is right now, in addition to the normal debate around ISDS, should be included in new agreements or not, there is a riling debate right now in the United States around should this administration strip ISDS out of existing agreements. US has 53 or so investment agreements with ISDS. And so Senator Warren and others have proposed to that the Biden administration should unilaterally, without Congress, essentially take ISDS out of free trade agreements and to terminate bilateral investment treaties. That's an issue on the table right now. Now, looking forward to the next administration, the actual topic of discussion, the Biden 2 or Trump 2. The overall point I'll make is it will depend on personnel. We saw this very clearly with Trump 1. My own personal view, for whatever it's worth, is that Ambassador Robert Lighthizer was singularly responsible for the shift in US policy on ISDS and the USMCA. Had there been a different USTR, it might have been a different outcome. And that's not to say that that is unusual. I think the individual choices, the cabinet members who a Trump 2 or Biden 2 would pick would naturally have a lot of influence and power over will there be ISDS and US agreements or not. The other thing I'll say in the framing of this issue is it will also depend upon how much the private sector and companies push for ISDS. As I mentioned during USMCA, I think the private sector had a sense that the house was on fire, as I like to say in the USMCA, that every trade issue was up for debate and companies had to sort of pick their favorite children to rescue and to let others go. And I think there was a view that ISDS for some industries is the number 1 or number 2 issue, but most industries, they prioritized other issues as number 1 or number 2. As a consequence, in the way that the sausage was made, ISDS maybe didn't get the attention that supporters of ISDS would have wanted. And so again, our company is going to push for it. Now, then moving to the sort of bulk of the meat of this presentation, when I look forward to the Biden 2 or Trump 2 administrations, I would say that there are dark clouds overall for those who want to have ISDS and agreements, but there are silver linings and possibilities for ISDS. In my view, there are pro-ISDS arguments that might appeal to both the Biden 2 and Trump 2 teams, but it would be a fight. Now, first, I'll talk about the sort of bread and butter issue of ISDS in new agreements. Would Biden 2 or Trump 2 support the negotiation inclusion of ISDS in new agreements? The dark clouds. Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, who I mentioned, whether he is in the administration or not, is viewed to be very influential in the Trump campaign now, and would be very influential in a second Trump term. I mentioned his antipathy towards ISDS. And now also the dynamic on Capitol Hill has changed. In 2018, 2019, he was pushing to scale back ISDS. On Capitol Hill, there were many mainstream sort of pro-business Republicans on the Hill, also Democrats on the Hill. A lot of them are gone. And so the dynamic on the Hill has changed. If a Lighthizer-led sort of let's get rid of ISDS ethos sort of dominates the Trump administration in part 2, they won't have the same kind of Hill opposition they faced in Trump 1. Okay, so this is again Trump. What are the silver linings? There's an argument that the dynamic in USMCA between the United States, Mexico, and Canada was fairly unique. The United States, the Trump administration had concerns about the movement of jobs and production over to Mexico. With Canada, there is a really interesting history of US-Canada investment disputes, many more than either side had anticipated. And so I think in 2017, 2018, there was movement on both sides to sort of reassess. The next negotiation, you're not going to have Mexico and Canada. You may have other parties, silver lining. The other point I'll make is Trump is transactional. He likes to make deals. This is his character. He makes deals. And in the past, in my experience as a civil servant in the Trump administration, there was flexibility and openness to considering ISDS in a deal. I'll mention in specifically the US dalliance with Kenya. There was not a completed free trade agreement negotiation with Kenya in that administration, but there were extensive internal discussions and also negotiations. And at the time, there were senior US officials, senior Trump administration officials who supported having some investor-state dispute settlement in that FTA. Again, noting that Kenya is not Mexico, Kenya is not Canada. There were not the same concerns about movement of jobs, production to Kenya. There were concerns about rule of law in Kenya. There were concerns about Chinese investment in Kenya and using US investment and backed by ISDS as a bulwark against Chinese investment in Kenya. And so these ideas were on the table. And I think that some of those same arguments around rule of law, around pushing back against, for example, Chinese investors, but not just, may be attractive in a second Trump administration. In a second Biden administration, so the dark clouds, I think the dark clouds in a second Biden administration are, I would say, significantly darker than under a Trump two. The past 3 years have been, I think, dispiriting for supporters of ISDS. While the Biden administration has not had to negotiate, an investment agreement and had to make the decision of including ISDS or not, the president and his staff have been very negative around using tools like ISDS to promote U.S. investment. And so I think the clouds are dark here. Again, personnel will be key, but nonetheless. So the silver linings. A second-term Democratic president, when you look at history, you look at President Obama, you look at President Clinton, second-term Democratic presidents tend to be more internationalist in their approach. Biden himself may decide to let his inner globalist shine in a second term. Presidents, including President Biden, reverse their positions regularly. It happened last week. You may follow the China Section 301 tariffs, which the president not only maintained, but decided to increase measurably. Go back and look at what President Biden said about the China Section 301 tariffs in 2019. More harsh on the 301 tariffs than harsh on ISDS at the time. And the other point I'll make, and I think this is important, is there is, I think, a pro-ISDS narrative that may appeal to whoever is in the Biden administration part two. I'll mention arguments around US competitiveness. US investors may not have access to ISDS, competing with international investors in third jurisdictions that do have access to ISDS. That may resonate. Rule of law arguments may resonate with Biden too. Protecting investments abroad that are critical to the green transition, for example, investments in critical minerals and mining, may be persuasive to a Biden 2 team. And finally, Biden 2 would have the chance to reshape or remake ISDS in its vision. And there are many different ways that the Biden team could decide to do so in elevating the importance of, for example, environmental and labor protection in the substantive rules. Other procedural or other ISDS reforms are tenable and imaginable. I think I may be over time, but just in the closing bit, this discussion has been focused on, will there be in a Biden or a Trump 2 new negotiations with ISDS? I do want to highlight a few separate discrete issues that either a Biden or a Trump 2 will face that will force them perhaps to address ISDS. One is in the USMCA context, and that is that folks who follow the USMCA may know that in 2026, under the treaty, under the agreement, there is a joint review process that will take place where Mexico, Canada, and the United States will sit down and assess the agreement. There's the possibility that it could be terminated. We could talk about all the details of that. And I think what the Biden administration will hear from many US investors in Mexico in particular is dissatisfaction and disappointment in a range of sectors. And they will tell the administration that the ISDS, the sort of narrow ISDS allowed under USMCA, has not been effective. As far as I know, there have not been any ISDS cases brought by US investors or Mexican investors under these new USMCA ISDS rules. And there's also not been any state-to-state dispute settlement. So the United States has the ability under USMCA to initiate claims as a government against Mexico or Canada on investment treaty issues. They've not done so. And so I think the Biden team will hear that from US investors, and the Biden team, or the Trump team, I should say, will have to assess, do we revisit the question of narrow, sort of skinny ISDS and USMCA or not? I will say that sometimes, from my perspective, you need to lose something to appreciate its value. And it may be that in 2026, both the Biden and Trump teams will take a fresh look at this issue. Two more discrete issues. UNCITRAL Working Group 3, this is a forum where folks may know there is a discussion around reform of ISDS rules, including the notion of creating a multilateral investment court, I think Mark mentioned, or a multilateral appellate mechanism. What would Biden or Trump do here. And this is important because based on the schedule in UNCITRAL Working Group 3, July of 2025, about a year from now, the working group is slated to make a decision on the investment court. So the next administration for the United States will decide its position in the working group on an investment court. For an appellate mechanism, it's July 2026. In my view, neither Biden 2 or Trump 2 is likely to support either an international investment court or an appellate mechanism for a number of reasons, including, and I think most importantly, the US experience in the WTO around the WTO appellate mechanism. And I will say that, again, having served in the Trump administration and also the Obama administration, I know that both sides had very serious concerns with a multilateral investment court, viewing it, for example, as entrenching a system in a permanent status that they already had difficulties with, and also questioning the kind of democratic accountability of a permanent court. One last discrete issue is the TC Energy case, which is the ongoing ICSID case involving the Keystone XL pipeline, $15 billion claim brought by a Canadian company against the United States, TC Energy. So when you look forward, that arbitration is ongoing right now. Looking at Trump 2, my assumption is that President Trump would restore TC Energy's permit to construct the Keystone pipeline. We don't know this, but that is what he did the first time around. On the first day in office, he reversed the Obama administration's decision to terminate that permit. And so my assumption, informed assumption, would be that Trump would restore that permit. That would get rid of the arbitration potentially, if the arbitration is ongoing at the time. With respect to the Biden administration, that is extremely unlikely that they would decide to reverse its position on this permit. And so again, if the arbitration is ongoing during a Biden 2, it's likely the arbitration would sort of go forward in jurisdiction on the merits. And I just highlight this in my closing because this case, I think, will be critical to the next generation of US policymaking around investor state. Certainly, if the US were to lose this case, a $15 billion claim touching on very sensitive public policy space in the view of certain folks, certainly in the Obama administration, that could lean the United States heavily against ISDS in the future. If they were to win, we'll have to see. But I'll pause there and return to Marin.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So that has been our round the world tour, and as Lauren said, I feel so much better educated on everything that's happening, and we see so many opportunities for change and transition, or maybe sometimes we're overselling those opportunities for change and transition, and maybe things won't be as dramatic as we think. So this is the point at which we're happy to open to questions from the floor. I think we can take questions online, although I admit I'm not entirely sure how. I assume using the chat function. And so happy to hear from the rest of you who've been listening. If you have questions about some of the particular comments that have been made about particular elections or overall trends crossing these different areas of the world. Any takers? Please. We'll have to share a microphone with you. So.
Thank you, Ian. Hi, everyone. My name is Munia. I have a question for whomever wants to take it, but it could be for Gaela. Taking into consideration that in Latin America, the defense of the state may change if there's an election, as in Spain, the Abogacía del Estado, it doesn't change, right? Would you be, let's say if there's elections in 3-4 months, I want to file my request for arbitration, would I be better off waiting for a new Defensa del Estado to come in and maybe they will be more sensitive to my case? Or would you say it's better to file very quickly with the Defensa del Estado that, is maybe a bit more mature and has its strategy or their team still there?
Thanks for the question. I would say do what's best for your claim and for your client, and certainly take into consideration any periods of limitation. I think waiting on the right defensa del Estado could put you into reading tea leaves territory. And that's not really a place you want to be. So let's say that you brought your request for arbitration, or you filed the notice with the current defensa del Estado. Well, it's going to change, it will change. I don't think there would be, even if you think that you could garner some sort of benefit from a future defense unit, state defense unit, you will likely get that. And if there were some benefit you could garner from the incumbent unit, it will be short-lived, right? So, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question to consider, and certainly something to plop into your risk-benefit analysis. But in the end, the defense unit that you get is going to be the defense unit that you get, and most likely there's not going to be much that you can do to really time that in the best way possible. It could be in certain administrations. I mean, really, I suppose we're talking mostly about Argentina here. Argentina's defense unit has been known for being, particularly aggressive in its defense of the state. Will that change under Milei? I don't know. Interesting. Interesting to consider. Will they be more likely to settle? I don't know. That would be parting with a lot of tradition. Virtually no state in the world settles investment arbitrations, or certainly they don't settle them on a very regular basis. So even if you do see a significant administration change from one party to the other, and the new party is known as being much more pro-business, and maybe for that reason might actually settle with investors, eventually the political considerations around that kind of come in, it seems, almost every time, and really hinder a state from openly engaging in settlement negotiations with another party. So long story short, I would file your claim when it makes most sense for the client, and not really consider whether there's an administration change.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ross. I have a question about the UK.
Just 1 second. Let's get a microphone to you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ross. I have a question about the UK elections. There's a sense for those of us who really follow UK politics that they're rolling up the drawbridge, and essentially your comments are to that effect as well. And of course, now they're threatening to pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights. So just another example of that. What I don't have a read of is where Keir Starmer is on international investment arbitration. I'm wondering if you can give some insight into that.
Yes, this is, I think, a perception which is shared by a lot of observers, and also, I mean, those of us that are fortunate enough to observe it from close within the UK. But Keir Starmer has. It's interesting, perhaps in another context, to discuss kind of his political evolution, but he is a pragmatist. He is doing, he is, let's say, refining his policy proposals significantly over, if you compare what he is saying he will do now with what he was elected on as leader of the Labour Party a few years ago. The situation is quite different. I think his instincts are that he's an internationalist, when it comes to investment arbitration, I think, frankly, there's a sense that there are bigger fish to fry, and this is not so much on his agenda. Negotiating trade agreements and investment agreements is. When it comes to investment arbitration, my concern is that it is easy to concede on ISDS. It has a signaling effect to, in particular, the kind of the left wing of his party and society. So I think there's a feeling, particularly on the basis of Europe-wide sentiments on ISDS, that we don't need it. It doesn't do anything, and whether that is something which is believed in reality or not, I think it's easy to just concede that. What I know is that there's kind of concerted lobbying efforts from civil society to not just preclude the negotiation of investment arbitration in new agreements, but also even to terminate investment treaties between the UK and other states. So there is political pressure there. I think even the current government's position vis-a-vis negotiation with Canada suggests that there is a hesitation to. Canada is an interesting example because currently the UK-Canada agreement, which is essentially the same agreement as the EU-Canada agreement that has ISDS, but the modernized post-Brexit UK-Canada agreement that has been accepted that it will not include ISDS. So I think that is an indication as to where things are going, but it does not mean that the drawing of the bridge will continue in the same way that has been unfolding with the current government after the elections. ISDS might be, I think, a victim to the political climate, but we'll have to wait and see.
Jose Antonio? Someone not us?
Now you can hear. My question is related to, or based on a premise that I really want you to prove me wrong, like based on the elections that you're seeing, etc. So it seems that for the past 10, 15 years, we have been going on a trend of increased protectionism in the US. Well, Trump came, and then came Biden, and protectionism continued. And that seems to be the trend in the world in general. And it seems also that there is a slight tendency also to get away from rule-based dispute resolution and more into diplomacy-based dispute resolution. Have you seen something different from everything that you have seen? And I really wish that you say, yes, you're wrong. I mean, sincerely. Any takers?
I won't say, yes, you're wrong. I think we observe in my practice and both in government and outside of government, observe an increase in this sort of protectionism that you're speaking of. But in the spirit of dark clouds and silver linings, a silver lining that you might want to think about is I've been a delegate in UNCITRAL Working Group 3 for too long, for 7 years, since the beginning of the negotiations. And I've always been impressed in that process. This is a process that is singularly about reforming investment or ISDS procedures, right? And for this 7-year period, there's been an enormous expense of time and effort and capital in trying to improve the system. And this is in the global north, in the global south, every continent, except for one maybe. And I think that to me, that process is, I don't want to go too far. I don't want to say it's an endorsement of ISDS, but I do think it's a recognition of the value of this dispute settlement, that it'd be much easier if these governments, rather than seeking to spend this enormous time and resources negotiating improvements, it'd be much easier for these governments to denounce their treaties or to step out of the system. And there are states, obviously, that are doing that. But I think the bulk of states see the system as valuable and want to improve it. It's an evolutionary system. It's a relatively new system in the scheme of international law and relations. And so that is when I am having difficulty sleeping at night, thinking about our practice and investment treaties and ISDS, I comfort myself with with the process and the commitment that these states have shown to improving the system.
Well, I think, Jose Antonio, I do think if there is a silver lining, certainly you might find a bit in Latin America with respect to ISDS. That seems to be a region where it is still alive and well, with a few exceptions of some states, some Latin American states pulling out of ISDS agreements. You know, with respect to protectionism, you know, and this, I labeled it as populism that has a nationalism and protectionism bent. That seems to be universal. But you know, but then the next question is, will it go beyond just nationalism and protectionism? And are you going to see states withdrawing or rescinding their support for ISDS? And at least so far in Latin America, it's you know, most countries are hanging on, and I wonder if in the United States it's just going to remain, you know, at a stasis. You know, perhaps no more new treaties with ISDS, but we're just going to maintain the status quo. I agree with Lauren that you know, we're probably not going to see much support for it, but I don't see the United States kind of changing its tack drastically. Now, depending on the incoming administration, yeah, then you start to wonder if you have a Trump 2 versus Biden 2. Trump 2 would be you know, an administration led by someone who's not particularly fond of the rule of law. So, you know, he likes to make deals, not so good on the rule of law concept. So what happens in that administration could actually foment a number of investment disputes. And I don't think that the United States is going to pull out of all of these investment agreements, but who knows?
Anybody else want to add anybody any other glimmers of hope? Sadly, no, apparently. One last question, maybe, or I think we've got a minute or two left. Anyone? All right, well, then maybe we will wrap up. We can circle back next year and see if any of our, you know, punditry and prognostication was correct, and see where we've landed. So.
Well, I want to thank you, Marin. You're very brave and, you know, got to the heart of this matter, and our panelists also were excellent in their assessments. I think we'll be back next year and see how this went. So thank you. I asked the group here to give thanks to our panelists. Nice round of applause. We are going to take a break now for about a half hour, and we have a very practical panel coming up at 3 o'clock on drafting memorials. And I'd invite folks to come back in the half hour. And thank you very much for everyone attending online and here in person. We do have another few days of programs. Tomorrow morning, we have a program from Singapore, then one from India. And then on Wednesday and Thursday, we complete with a program from Warsaw and then from Bogota. So we have a busy conference still to complete, but we're about halfway there. And this was a great opportunity to hear from a great group of folks. So thank you very much. And we'll see you at the next conference. Thanks for it.